It's time for this week's Truth in Politics panel. Donald Trump is about to be sworn in as the next president of the United States. How are our leaders preparing, and what does this mean for people living in Canada? Joining us now is Winnipeg Free Press columnist Niigaan Sinclair and Paskwâw Strategies Jennifer Laewetz. So Niigaan, there are some developments in the search for a new leader of the Liberal Party. So far, a handful of candidates have thrown their hat into the ring, and more are considering before the deadline on January 23rd. What do you make of the current crop of candidates, and do any of them stand out to you?
Well, it's all pretty much as predicted. It will be a Freeland-Carney likely front-runner race. There are some other candidates, including Mi'kmaq candidate Jamie Battiste, who has certainly announced that he will seek the leadership. This is a Carney-Freeland kind of inner liberal that scuffle that will certainly look to kind of insider, outsider versus the party. Will it be something in which Freeland, who's very closely tied to Trudeau, even though in the final days had left him, continue some of the legacies that Trudeau have? Or will Carney, who is a self-professed outsider, be able to take some sort of leadership, offer a fresh vision to the party, and really offer something that people who are quite outside of the Trudeau legacy are certainly feeling that they're concerned and not comfortable with what Trudeau has done over the past few years. Will he be able to refresh the party, give a new paint to a very old building?
Jennifer, Niigaan touched upon this a little bit. Mi'kmaq MP Jaime Battiste has announced his intention to enter the race. Do you think he's a serious contender to become the next leader of the Liberal Party?
I don't think he's a serious contender against the names like Chrystia Freeland and Mark Carney. And I also think, this might be an unpopular opinion, but I also think that this is kind of a shame, to be honest with you, because he is an Indigenous MP, and he is the the parliamentary secretary, to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. And now, especially across Native country, we have really promoted the idea that this could be Canada's first Indigenous prime minister, even though it might be on an interim basis and maybe a few weeks to a couple months. But there was a real opportunity there to see, something happen for the very first time. But again, it goes back to the last 5 years of his time in government. Where have you been? We have seen MPs within the Liberal Party break party ranks on issues that are very close to home to them. Anthony Housefather, Rob Oliphant, we've seen that happen. So I think there was a real opportunity here for him to come out, not swinging, but coming out a little bit stronger on issues like child welfare and, other areas that our people have been watching and paying very close attention to government and some of the strongest voices on the bench, but he just wasn't there. And so now I guess I have to ask that question of where have you been and why should we trust you now?
Mm-hmm. And Niigaan, a federal election is likely around the corner, but U.S. President-elect Donald Trump will be in power long before that happens. How could Trump's presidency affect the federal election process and results here in Canada?
So first, apologies to Jaime Battiste for mispronouncing his name, but the Trump election and the inauguration, which we are just a few days away from, will substantially impact both Canada in terms of the 25% per promised tariffs that will impact particularly energy and resource use here in the country, which we know drastically will impact Indigenous and Canadian relations because it will discourage companies to act ethically, to act responsibly when it comes to dealing with First Nations, because their money will be even tighter than ever as we see tariffs coming down and impacting corporations' bottom line, which they will pass on to Canadians, which will create a further situation. And we know that when resource and energy use becomes on the table and becomes of concern to Canadians, usually Indigenous peoples talking about Indigenous rights suddenly are seen as in the way and conflictual and not on the national agenda or not on the program, et cetera, which creates a combative relationship. That will be undoubtedly seen on the ground between Indigenous peoples, First Nations particularly, and Canadians. But I also think that this will create a kind of culture And we're seeing it amongst the Canadian premiers in particular, of trying to fill the vacuum of who will speak for Canada. Will Canada have a united voice? For example, Alberta seems to be acting completely on its own, surprise, surprise, when it comes to dealing with Trump. Meanwhile, all the other Canadian premiers are coming together, showing a united front and promising things like retaliatory tariffs when it comes to the United States. Who will be that voice that will come to lead the country? Will it be a federal leader like Pierre Poilievre or even Mark Carney or Chrystia Freeland, or will it be a Canadian premier, which oddly enough, Doug Ford is filling into that space, being a leader of the Federation. He's the chair of the Federation at the moment. Who will be Captain Canada in relation to the United States? And that natural will be something that First Nations and Métis and Inuit communities want to watch closely.
And speaking of premiers, on Wednesday, Canada's premiers met with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Ottawa for a First Ministers meeting, and it heavily focused on Canada-US relations. Jennifer, what part do the premiers of Canada have to play in this ongoing relationship between Canada and the US?
I think there's actually a pretty big task that is, put into the premier's hands, especially as, some of them have to deal with those conversations around the border. Premier Scott Moe had announced his border plans. I think it was sometime earlier this week. We saw Premier Wab Kinew was down in the United States. Premier Doug Ford was front and center on television with a Canada's not for sale hat. And I think that these premiers are actually taking a really good approach. I do want to commend Wab Kinew, who seems to have a really good ability to unite, overall has a really good personality. So it seems, I watched his press conference yesterday and yeah, he's doing some good work. But at the same time, when we're talking about Premier Danielle Smith, I think that's going to pose a real challenge for the other premiers who seem to all be kind of front facing right now, because Canada's kind of at a crossroads with that conversation of, is Canada for sale? Is it becoming the 51st state? Alberta is quite literally sometimes on their own, where they're like, we're separating, we're done with Canada. So all these other premiers are tasked with bringing Alberta back to the table and trying to promote unity. And yeah, I think we have some premiers right now that are doing a pretty good job at, speaking on behalf of Canada, while that leadership lacks in Ottawa.
Niigaan, in the context of another 4-year Trump administration and strong signs of a possible Poilievre government on the horizon here in Canada, what do you think the next several years will look like for Indigenous peoples on either side of the border?
I'll give a view that's kind of half empty, but also give a view that's half full. So half empty. We're going to see an aggressive agenda that will be reminiscent of some of the darker days of Stephen Harper, in which there was omnibus legislations that were very aggressive. And in many ways, Trudeau continued some of those, but perhaps pursued a more progressive agenda that would talk more about Indigenous rights. But during those days of Stephen Harper, we saw the most aggressive movements towards Indigenous lands and resources, a very combative atmosphere, and an atmosphere that created a lot of animosity and rancor, I think, between everyday Canadians who maybe didn't understand that what we were talking about was the theft of Indigenous territories, the removal of the protections of water, and also the mistreatment of Indigenous leadership, treating them very much like, I will handpick who I will work for. Think of that famous meeting that Stephen Harper had where he handpicked who he would be meeting with. Now, that's the glass half empty way of seeing it. Here's the glass half full way of seeing it. We have never seen a more unified First Nations, Inuit, and Métis movement than Idle No More, which came in reaction to the aggressive policies of Stephen Harper. And so here's what I've been saying to everybody who will listen. Yes, we will see a dark days ahead. Yes, we will see divisive rhetoric. We will see often rhetoric that's full of racism, full of aggression, and will create some violence. But I also think that we need to double down on who we fundamentally are as Indigenous peoples, who are people who are committed to relationships with the earth, relationships with each other, to treaty, and most of all, that when we do that, we can withstand anything. And we have proven that over centuries, whether it be residential schools, the Indian Act, or multiple prime ministers who have been hell-bent on destroying us. We have always responded by collectively working with each other, mobilizing, resisting, and ultimately remaking our relationships with countries as a result.
For sure, that's a great answer, and it's nice to look at things from a glass half empty and glass half full, because it's good to have hope, but also be realistic about the situation. Thanks for that one, Niigaan. Jennifer, we talked about tariffs a little bit earlier, but they are still a big topic of discussion. How do you think Trump's threats of tariffs on things like lumber, oil and gas, hydroelectricity, things like that, how do you think that they would affect Indigenous communities if he does follow through with them?
Well, just like everything else, Indigenous people in this country are the ones who are going to feel it the most. You know, when you think of the pyramid or the totem pole and who is at the bottom of it, it is inevitably always going to be our population and our people that are going to suffer the most. And especially in our remote and northern communities, where if the cost on groceries or anything like that rise, who is impacted the most? And that's what kind of, concerns me a little bit right now. And we go back to that unity piece, especially amongst our people. And even to echo what Niigaan was saying about the government changing, now more than ever, I think all of our eyes need to be turning on our leadership. And we need to be very, very serious about the people who are managing our communities, not just from like chief and councils, but to the people working in our band offices and our organization as a whole. Now more than ever is the time to strengthen our governance, because if we want to discuss sovereignty, we want to discuss rights, we need to start promoting the unity of our communities and start healing them, because when the funding slows down in Ottawa, who is impacted the most on the nations? Because it's not going to be flowing as much. We know that under a Poilievre government. So we need to start looking to the future, start getting our people more educated in various different skills so that we can go back to community and bring that knowledge in to help build our people up. Because I don't think any of these politicians at the end of the day are going to save us. And I think, especially my last point here, but we're talking about the energy sector and jobs and growth. And I've noticed that our nations are really starting to have that conversation around resource development now more than ever. But while we're ramping up the popularity amongst bringing oil and gas into our communities, that conversation around consultation hasn't increased. And that concerns me, because where is that consultation? It's not just up to chief and councils, it's up to the membership, it's up to the people on those nations, the elders, the knowledge keepers, and creating really, really good sound policies on the nations on how they move forward with what they do with their lands.
Mm-hmm. And on Wednesday, Trudeau said that he supports a dollar-for-dollar response to U.S. tariffs, but says Canada will wait to see what Trump does before making their response. Niigaan, last question to you. What do you make of this plan to retaliate with additional tariffs?
Yeah, I mean, it will be a trade war. That's at the end of the day. What Trump is evoking through the promise of a 25% tariff, and whether he brings it forth or not, we really have to look to what he did with aluminum and with other resources the last time around when he was president. And he did bring in 10% tariffs, which created a massive increase in consumer purchase costs. It did not result in the bottom line shifting for corporations who continue to issue bonuses to CEOs, who continue to expand. The reality is that it's going to be on the everyday consumer. And I think there will be an atmosphere in which the public will support retaliatory tariffs, even if they are paying more, because Trump is so deeply unpopular in Canada, even amongst all parties. It doesn't really matter what federal party or provincial party, with the maybe exception of Alberta. Trump is deeply unpopular, and so when he imposes those tariffs, I think Canadians will be on board for retaliating, even if sometimes they see that there will be a cost to that trade war, and it will be felt by everybody, from whether it be the grocery store, the gas pump, or even on their gas bills, or whatever they would to go out and buy a car. The automotive industry is really going to take a hit in that regard. Absolutely.
That's all the time we have for your Truth in Politics panel this week. Jennifer, Niigaan, thank you both for joining us, and we'll see you back here next week.
Yeah, Miigwech, thanks.